His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a phenomenon who began writing music at 4, gave his first public concert at 6, performed for kings, started composing operas at 12, and died at 35 in hardship, laid to rest without a headstone, with scarcely anyone there. This video tells Mozart's story in full, from the first appearances to the last note, how he lived, what he strove for, and why his music still rings out. Leave ideas for new episodes in the comments and subscribe. The Stories for Sleep premiere here every day.
The Wonder Child. The future great composer was born on 27 January 1756 in Salzburg, in a house on Getreidegasse. It was a small archiepiscopal city where the clatter of timber bridges and the singing of church choirs blended into a soundscape familiar to every local. His father, Leopold Mozart, served at court as vice Kapellmeister, was a noted violinist and the author of an influential violin method. His mother, Anna Maria, kept the home and raised the children. Older daughter Maria Anna, affectionately Nannerl, and the younger son, Wolfgang. From his earliest years, the boy showed unusual gifts. Already teaching his daughter, Leopold noticed how intently Wolfgang watched her lessons. At 3, he could memorize complete tunes with ease. At 4, he tried to reproduce them on the clavier. According to Leopold's recollections, the boy repeated whatever he heard with uncanny precision. If Nannerl slipped, he would stop and correct her. At 4, Leopold began systematic instruction, first keyboard playing, then basic theory. By 5, Wolfgang was already composing simple pieces, dictating them to his father, who carefully wrote down every note and added at the bottom, "Composed by my son at the age of 5." News of the boy's abilities spread beyond family friends. Salzburg was small, and talk of a child who could improvise at the keyboard and recognize chords while blindfolded traveled fast. At first, the musical evenings where Mozart played were intimate, at friends' homes, among the local nobility, at the archiepiscopal court. Later, his father began arranging full demonstrations, inviting listeners not merely out of curiosity, but to persuade them this was no conjurer, but a real musician. One such evening was at the home of Count Lodron. Guests gathered in a large hall where candlelight wavered in mirrors and glass. Little Wolfgang stepped to the keyboard, bowed, and, at the audience's request, began to play. One guest blindfolded him, another struck a random string of notes. The boy instantly reproduced the sequence. Then he performed a short piece of his own, and at further urging, improvised a fugue on the spot. Initially shy, he soon grew assured, answering questions, joking, and listening with interest. The company was astounded. Yet behind such bright evenings lay days and months of steady work. Music sounded almost without pause in the Mozart household. Leopold was demanding, no idleness, a strict routine. Mornings began with practice, followed by written tasks, score analysis, reading, memorization. Still, these lessons felt nothing like compulsion. Wolfgang was lively and cheerful, yet he experienced music as part of his nature. He did not play for praise. Later he wrote that he knew music before he knew words. He did not play for the public, though he enjoyed attention, but because he could not help playing. He switched easily between performance and composition, between experimenting at the keyboard and reading scores. His favorite pastime was a challenge from his father: write variations on a theme set by Nannerl. Once, around age 6, he heard the cathedral organ and, holding his breath, stood through the entire concert on the cold stone floor. Afterward, he begged his father to let him try the instrument. He had to stand on a platform to reach the keys. Despite the size of the organ and the complexity of the stops, he played a simple chorale and improvised upon it so deftly that the elderly organist watching murmured, "This boy's ear is heaven high." By 7, Mozart already had the reputation of a marvel, playing in aristocratic homes, composing at guests' requests, writing short instrumental pieces and overtures. The archbishop invited him to perform at court. Dressed in a velvet coat, the boy played 3 of his miniatures seated beside his father. That evening, tradition says, he received a gold medal from the archbishop, a token of approval and a foreshadowing of future recognition. But Salzburg was too tight a circle. Leopold understood that his son's talent would be truly measured only beyond their city, in Paris, London, Rome, Munich. He began preparing to travel. But that is another chapter. In those first years, full of clavier sounds, children's voices, the sense of wax and paper, amid snows and bell peals, more than a career was being born. A destiny. Not by accident, not through one man's will, but through a rare gift fused with discipline and a love for a calling Mozart seemed not to choose. He was born to it.
A musical tour of Europe. When the boy turned 6, Leopold became convinced that his talent could not be confined either by their walls in Salzburg or by the local music scene. For Wolfgang to grow, he must be shown to a wider public and, perhaps, secured a future. Thus the plan for a long journey took root, first across Austria and Germany, then through Europe. The first stop was Munich, where Mozart performed at the court of the Bavarian Elector. The hall was full of nobility and clergy, and, Leopold recorded, the boy behaved calmly, played several pieces on the clavier, improvised, and after the concert engaged in musical games with Nannerl. He peered curiously at the court organs, stood on tiptoe, and joyfully tried a few chords. From Munich, the family went to Vienna, where the children played at the court of Empress Maria Theresa. Nannerl wore a blue dress, Wolfgang a white coat with silver trim. They performed in alternation and as a duo, and, so eyewitnesses claimed, during an interval, the boy walked up to the Empress and unabashedly hugged her. Courtiers were startled, but Maria Theresa only smiled and embraced him like a mother. That simple gesture impressed the father more than any applause. Fame was not the journey's only companion. Roads were rough, especially in cold seasons. Coaches slogged through mire. Lodgings were modest. The children's health suffered from constant travel. In the small town of Bruck, Wolfgang fell seriously ill, feverish and delirious, singing snatches in his sleep as if the inner music would not stop. In 1763, the grand tour began in earnest. Their route traced Linz, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Mannheim, Frankfurt, Cologne, Bonn, then Paris, on to London, and on through the Netherlands. They lingered weeks in each city, playing for courts, aristocratic homes, private salons, and public halls. Leopold kept a detailed diary, dates, programs, reactions. In Mannheim, they performed for Elector Karl Theodor. In Frankfurt, the audience was especially moved by an improvisation on a set theme. In Bonn, so the tale goes, Johann van Beethoven, father of the future Titan, attended and remembered the boy as nature's wonder. Paris received them for about 5 months. Initial performances drew moderate attention. After an invitation to Versailles, things changed. At the court of Louis XV, the children played with striking success. Queen Maria Leszczyńska especially praised Wolfgang's demeanor. He not only performed with confidence, but answered questions with easy grace, showing musicality and quick wit. London became one of the journey's most significant chapters. The family spent more than a year in the English capital. There, Wolfgang met Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach became an informal mentor, opening new forms and compositional approaches. They played duets, discussed thematic development, and this contact left a clear mark on the boy's style. Leopold wrote with satisfaction that his son woke each morning thinking of Bach, not as duty, but as delight. In London, Wolfgang composed his first symphony in E-flat major, a step beyond small pieces toward larger forms. He dictated parts to his father, combined instruments, developed themes, all at age 8. A private performance of the symphony impressed even the skeptics. Not everything went smoothly. In autumn 1765, Leopold fell gravely ill and was bedridden for weeks. Performances ceased. Nannerl and Wolfgang stayed home, their mother nursing their father. Finances tightened. After Leopold recovered, they moved on to the Netherlands. In The Hague, Wolfgang performed new keyboard pieces and received a commission to write sonatas. But in January, he himself fell dangerously ill, likely typhus. For weeks he lay in bed with high fever. Physicians were cautious. Thankfully, the illness retreated, and by March he could play again. In spring, the family returned through Paris into Switzerland and, via Munich, reached Salzburg in the summer of 1766. The tour had lasted nearly 3.5 years. In that time, Wolfgang did more than grow. He forged a musical mind based not solely on intuition, but on experience. How audiences respond in different countries, what the French prefer, what the English esteem, how orchestras sound under varied traditions. He learned from the best, at an age when other children were only learning their letters. On their return, Leopold wrote, "He is no longer merely a child who plays the clavier. He now knows how music is put together." That sentence summed up not just a journey, but an entire stage of maturing, artistic, professional, human.
Service in Salzburg and a revolt against authority. After the long European travels, the family settled again in Salzburg in the summer of 1766. A city once full of new impressions now felt different, tight, orderly, unable to contain expectations born on Europe's best stages. Still, Leopold was a court musician bound by duty, and Mozart was expected to follow. In 1772, at 16, he was appointed concertmaster of the Archiepiscopal Chapel, a grand title masking narrow responsibilities. He answered to the Kapellmeister, received a fixed salary, and was to compose by order without full creative freedom. Nevertheless, Mozart kept writing actively. In the 1770s came symphonies, serenades, masses, litanies, the Coronation Mass, the Loretto Litany, the Hofner Serenade, and more. Many were performed in Salzburg and met with respect rather than rapture. The local public was conservative, while Mozart's music sought a horizon beyond courtly requirements. Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo, installed in 1772, was strict, rational, and exacting. He aimed to reform the chapel, cut excess, and tightly manage his musicians, seeing them first as servants, not artists. One early clash concerned Munich. The archbishop initially refused to release Mozart to attend the production of his opera La Finta Giardiniera. The departure was eventually arranged not without pressure from Munich's court. The opera succeeded, and Mozart was warmly received. Back in Salzburg, the atmosphere cooled. For Colloredo, obedience and service mattered more than fame elsewhere. The inner conflict grew. Mozart felt fettered. He continued to write church music, but poured more personal feeling into it than usual. Harmonies grew bolder, melodies more expressive, masses intended for liturgy increasingly sounded like works addressed to the inner life. Years later, Mozart requested extended leave to seek a post beyond Salzburg. The archbishop allowed it on condition that Leopold remain, a painful decision. The father, always at his son's side, could not leave court. Thus, Anna Maria traveled with Wolfgang. They visited Mannheim, Augsburg, Munich, Paris.
Everywhere Mozart sought work, offered his services, played, composed, receiving polite refusals or vague promises. In Mannheim, he fell in love with Eloisa Weber, an aspiring singer, but the relationship was brief and painful. Tragedy struck in Paris. His mother fell ill and died, leaving Mozart alone in a foreign city. What began as an escape from the archbishop's power ended in personal loss and a collapsed plan. Back in Salzburg, he was re-engaged, this time as court organist. On paper, it was a step up. In essence, little changed. He had to write for services and could not travel without permission. Meanwhile, Salzburg felt more stifling. Space seemed to shrink. Creative possibility dimmed. Loyal to hierarchy, Leopold struggled to understand Wolfgang's urge for independence. Their letters grew tense, Leopold insisting on patience and prudence, Wolfgang replying that he was not a menial, but a man endowed with a gift, unwilling to be treated like a liveried lackey. In spring, Colloredo came to Vienna with his musicians. In the capital, Mozart performed in salons, played at court, met influential people, and sensed that the Viennese milieu could accept him as an equal. When the archbishop banned side commissions and began addressing Mozart through servants, he broke. In a letter to his father, he wrote that he had been kicked out and would not beg to return. In May, he formally left the archbishop's service, without steady income or patrons, but with a sense of release. It was the beginning of a new chapter, life as a free artist, risky, hopeful, combative.
Vienna and the struggle for independence. After the final break with Colloredo, Mozart remained in Vienna not by accident, but from an inner conviction that he could not return to Salzburg. In the imperial capital, he aimed to build an independent life, without humiliations, rigid ranks, or constant deference to superiors. It was a daring choice, largely unprecedented for his time. A young musician without a court post, stable pay, or powerful patrons, determined to live by talent alone. He first lodged with the Weber family, old acquaintances from Mannheim now in Vienna. Aloysia was there, once the focus of his affection, but married. His attention slowly turned to her younger sister, Constanza, who had a musical ear, a pleasant voice, and a gentle character. Their bond grew through rehearsals, walks, and homely evenings, an attachment he neither sought nor resisted. He supported himself by private teaching, playing in aristocratic homes, and composing on commission. He was welcome in musical salons, not only for his playing, but for his wit, lightness, and gift for improvisation that charmed audiences. At first, his income covered rent and a modest life, yet without certainty. He wrote to his father in Salzburg trying to convince him all was well, though in reality he often borrowed or waited weeks for fees. His relationship with Constanza became serious. In letters to Leopold, he presented matters cautiously, knowing his father disapproved of the Weber connection and doubted Wolfgang's independence. After months of reflection and quarrels, including with Constanza, Mozart decided to marry despite disapproval. The wedding took place at St. Stephen's Cathedral, simple, without his father, and without musical pomp. In letters to Salzburg, he soon assured Leopold that Constanza was virtuous, industrious, and supportive. The reply was cool, dry approval rather than blessing. A crucial chance arrived. Emperor Joseph II commissioned a German-language opera for the Burg Theater as part of a broader push for national theater. Mozart composed Die Entführung aus dem Serail, the abduction from the seraglio. The process was hard. Disputes with the librettist, reworked arias, attention to singers, added orchestral effects. The premiere stirred the city. According to legend, the emperor quipped, "Too beautiful, too many notes," and Mozart replied, "Exactly as many as needed."
The opera brought renown and proved he could do more than salon virtuosity. He could master large-scale drama. Yet a permanent post did not follow. Income stayed irregular. He increasingly relied on subscriptions, rented halls, printed notices himself, organized concerts, and appeared as both conductor and soloist. For the next 2 years, he worked relentlessly. He wrote piano concertos, quartets, serenades, sacred music. Among the most important was the Great Mass in C minor, with Constanza singing soprano. Leopold attended the premiere. Though left unfinished, the Mass expressed gratitude, faith, love, and a longing for reconciliation. Sadness shadowed these years. Their first child, Raimund, lived only 2 months. Mozart felt the loss keenly. His letters grew more reserved. The levity faded. Mentions of illness, fatigue, and worry became more frequent. Later children would follow, but only 2. Carl Thomas and Franz Xavier would reach adulthood. Relations with Leopold gradually cooled. The father still advised, criticized, and recommended, but grasped less and less that his son lived by different coordinates, without a post, without regularity, but with a sense of personal path. Wolfgang's replies became more ironic and measured. Their divergence lay not in values, but in views of order and freedom. Money remained unstable. Some concerts earned well, others almost nothing. He kept teaching, took commissions from patrons, negotiated with publishers. Expenses rose. He rented good apartments, spent on clothing, maintained a higher style, partly to fit the capital's milieu, partly to show himself equal to the titled. Yet he never stopped writing. Across these years came 12 piano concertos, string quartets, sonatas, arias, chamber works. He rose early, worked by day, performed by night. Tired, ailing, complaining of headaches, he worked on. His music grew mature, dense, full of inflections unknown in his early pieces. He no longer wrote to astonish. He wrote to tell the truth inside him.
Years of fame and letdowns. Vienna knew him as a dazzling pianist, a gifted composer, a man who could write anything, from opera to chamber ensemble, mass to concert aria. He held no permanent court post, had no ranks or regalia, yet stood at the center of attention, invited to play, recommended to pupils, written about in the city's papers. Behind the sheen lay a nervy life of anxieties, financial gaps, and a constant need to re-earn recognition. After the abduction, he hoped for a standing court commission, or at least a position with a regular income. Joseph II praised him, joked about too many notes, but nothing concrete followed. Safer, more predictable composers took court jobs, while Mozart remained the free artist, dependent on taste, orders, and ingenuity. He refused to yield. He organized subscription concerts where he led and played his own works. In these seasons, he wrote a sequence of superb piano concertos, numbers 14 to 21, the Radiant C major, the only D minor concerto, his sole minor key entry in the genre, dramatic and intense. The orchestral writing demanded attentive listening. Not every audience was ready. Joseph Haydn understood. Their friendship began professionally and deepened into personal warmth. Older and revered across Europe, Haydn treated Mozart with rare respect. After hearing a set of quartets that Wolfgang had written under Haydn's influence, Haydn told Leopold, quote, "Before God, I tell you, your son is the greatest composer known to me." Unquote. Mozart, in turn, called Haydn his teacher and friend. Meanwhile, the capital moved to its own rhythms. Fashions changed quickly. Audiences were fickle. Some concerts sold out, others barely filled. Students came and went. Rents rose.
so did costs. Despite outward success, he had no reserve. Proceeds vanished into lodging, a fine fortepiano, new clothes, servants. He didn't live modestly, not from arrogance, but because he did not know another way to live in that world. By the late 1780s, he finished Le Nozze di Figaro, with a libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte, based on Beaumarchais. The text was politically sensitive, but refashioned to avoid open criticism of the nobility. Mozart poured in rapid energy, character, drama, humor. Vienna's reaction was warm, but not rapturous. The opera was long, complex, required close attention. In a city enamored of Italian lightness, not everyone embraced it. Performances continued, but briefly. Prague was the opposite. The public fell in love. Newspapers said arias were sung in the streets. Mozart traveled to conduct in person and was welcomed with ovations, invited to the best houses. It was one of the rare moments when he felt understood not only by the mind, but by the heart. He said, quote, "In Prague, they know what music is," unquote. Even then, no long-term stability followed. After success came silence. After applause, a week without money. After an imperial box performance, humiliating waits were a publisher's payment. Psychologically, it drained him. He did not complain openly, but increasingly mentioned delays and the burden of doing everything himself. He was tired not of composing, but of the accounting after every concert and the struggle for repeat performances after every premiere. Still, he went on. His strength lay in not stopping. He rose early, wrote while traveling, composed between lessons, sketches piled up, unfinished themes and drafts to which he returned months or years later. These were his peak years and the foretaste of fatigue. He was recognized but unsettled, respected yet unsupported. His music grew deeper while the public did not always follow. The tension sharpened between inspiration and necessity, freedom and vulnerability. And he kept going, not from vanity or fear, but from the old necessity within him. Not composing was impossible.
Mozart and Salieri. Myth and reality. In his final years, Mozart's position was complicated. On one hand, he was widely known as a leading composer, played at court, wrote operas successful beyond Vienna, and was loved by audiences. On the other, he lacked a permanent post. His family's finances stayed precarious, and in Vienna, where connections and court intrigue often mattered more than talent, he increasingly felt an outsider. In that pressure-filled atmosphere, a durable myth took shape: his rivalry with Antonio Salieri. Both worked in Vienna and moved in the same circles, but the image of personal enmity was inflated and largely constructed after Mozart's death. Salieri, 6 years older and Italian-born, held high posts in the Habsburg court music hierarchy from the late 1770s. His style was more traditional and attuned to court taste. Though not without ambition, his career was stable and diplomatic, conforming to protocol. He was Kapellmeister, mentored many future composers, enjoyed imperial respect, and served as a musical mainstay. Mozart, by contrast, lived independently, without a secure post, often battled money troubles, and chose to write not by protocol, but by inner call. That independence, grammatic musical speech, and freedom of mind were perceived less as a challenge to Salieri personally than to the whole court system. There is no proof of bitter conflict. In Mozart's letters, Salieri appears rarely and mostly in neutral or mildly suspicious tones, especially when productions or posts slipped away. In one letter, he grouses that Salieri and his clique hampered him. The words read more as general frustration than accusation. Contemporaries left no accounts of quarrels. On the contrary, Salieri conducted the abduction from the Seraglio and the magic flute with respect and praised Mozart's gifts,
even if he did not share every experiment. After Mozart's death, the myth of envy, and even crime, flourished. Rumors sprang up that Salieri poisoned Mozart and ordered the Requiem. There is no basis for any of it. No testimony or documents support the tale. Yet the image of a secret rival gnawing at a genius proved theatrically irresistible. In the 19th century, Pushkin's Mozart and Salieri cast Salieri as a cold, envious man, unable to bear another's genius. In the 20th, Peter Shaffer's Amadeus and Milos Forman's film fixed that image for mass audiences. These works triumphed on stage and screen, but distorted history. In reality, Salieri, after Mozart's death, taught actively, including Mozart's son, Franz Xavier, and, by students' recollections, honored Mozart's memory. At the very end of his life, he suffered mental illness and may have uttered confused phrases, but contemporaries, doctors, and pupils dismissed them. By the 19th century, music historians concluded that charges against Salieri were unfounded and contradicted by facts. What existed was not personal feud, but a collision of systems. On one side, the free artist, challenging norms, seeking expression and individuality. On the other, a representative of the academic court school, answering institutional expectations. This tension pervaded Vienna's late 18th century musical life and colored perceptions of both men. Mozart felt it. He knew he did not belong to the courtly circle, that he could not please as a court musician was expected to. He wrote that he found truer recognition in Prague than in Vienna, and that real listeners sat not in the emperor's box, but among ordinary townspeople. His independence and refusal to mold himself to patrons' tastes made him inconvenient, and perhaps that is why the image of an enemy, however imaginary, took root so easily. Beyond the myths remained reality. There was no feud. There were different paths, characters, styles, and a turbulent age of change. And already this road was leading Mozart to his final commission, the Requiem, the subject of the next chapter.
The Requiem and the Last Months. In the summer of 1791, while working on the magic flute and preparing to travel to Prague with the new opera La Clemenza di Tito, a stranger came to the Mozart's Vienna home. Dressed plainly in a dark cloak, he spoke with restrained solemnity. He delivered a commission for a Requiem Mass, refused to give his master's name, paid in advance, demanded secrecy, and asked only that the work be majestic. No rush was required. Mozart, surprised but flattered, agreed. The patron's identity remained hidden for years. Only later was it learned that Count Franz von Walsegg, an amateur who routinely ordered music to perform under his own name, had initiated it. His wife had died in 1791, and he sought to memorialize her with a solemn requiem, remaining, as always, in the background. Everything went through an intermediary, so the composer's name would not appear in the parts. Mozart did not know who commissioned the work, and scarcely asked further, yet the arrival of the silent envoy, like a figure from a funeral rite, struck him more than he admitted. Almost at once, he told Constanza and friends that he was writing the Requiem for himself. The words were not yet fear of death, but against exhaustion, constant work, inner strain, and the anxious atmosphere, ominous. That summer, he worked with fierce intensity. The magic flute, light in form but philosophical in meaning, full of symbols, Masonic allusions, faith in reason and light, was in rehearsal. He coached singers, revised the score during staging, and conducted. The late September premiere met great success. Witnesses noted he looked joyful but spent. He conducted many performances despite growing weakness. At the same time, he labored over La Clemenza di Tito for Leopold II's coronation in Prague, traveled briefly, presented it, returned, and immediately took up the Requiem again.
which began to fill all his hours. He worked mornings, afternoons, late nights, dictating to pupils, comparing versions, discarding drafts and starting anew. On the hardest days, he had the keyboard brought to his bed, though he could barely play. He poured his remaining strength into the music. Progress slowed. He completed the Introit and Kyrie and nearly all the great sequence sections of Judgment, Divine Majesty, The Damned, and The Day of Tears before his strength failed. In early November, he fell ill. First headaches and fatigue, then high fever, swelling, weakness, sleeplessness. Constanza, alarmed, sent him to Baden. It did little. Soon he could not leave the house. Friends kept watch in turns. His pupil Franz Xavier Süssmayr became his chief assistant, taking dictation, working on orchestration. The house grew quiet. Constanza tried not to make noise, brought warm food and infusions. Evenings he asked to hear the Latin lines, especially Confutatis Maledictus and Lacrimosa dies illa. He listened silently, sometimes closing his eyes, sometimes moving his lips. Süssmayr later recalled Mozart saying, "I feel I am writing this for myself." On 3rd December, several friends gathered in his room to sing portions of the Requiem, to comfort him. They sang, he listened, and legend says tried to enter on the Lacrimosa, but his voice failed. He only shook his head. He understood he would not finish. He gave Süssmayr instructions, what to complete, how to distribute parts, how to keep the intended spirit. A month after the master's death, Süssmayr would complete the score from these verbal directives. In the night of 4 through 5th December, his condition worsened sharply. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He called for Constanza, tried to speak, but his voice weakened. At about 1 a.m. on 5th December 1791, he died. He was 35.
Burial and afterfame. The day, 5 December 1791, was cold and unkind in Vienna. Low clouds, dirty snow, a gray mist driven by wind through side streets and outskirts. Early that morning, with little preparation, without music and pomp, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's body was blessed at St. Stephen's Cathedral. The ceremony was quiet. Only a few friends and close acquaintances attended. His wife was absent, exhausted by sleepless nights and grief, and on doctor's orders, Constanza could not leave the bed. The coffin was plain wood. It was taken to St. Mark's Cemetery, a countryside necropolis then, ringed by fields and small groves. As a non-noble, Mozart was buried in a so-called common grave of the third class. This did not mean a mass pit, as later retellings claimed, rather a modest burial without an individual monument, and without perpetual rights to the plot. After 10 years, as customary, the grave would be reopened and bones moved to the ossuary. Later, Constanza tried to locate the exact place, but it proved impossible. No stone, no records, no witnesses remained. His grave was lost. Mozart's death caused no great public stir. Newspapers wrote brief notices. His operas continued in the theaters with no special fervor. Musicians he had worked with were engaged elsewhere or quickly changed repertoire. Life went on as if nothing had happened. The first months were hard for his family. Money was nearly gone. The Requiem was unfinished. Many works survived in scattered manuscripts. Constanza, with 2 children, began fighting for her husband's memory as a means of survival. She gathered scores, contacted publishers, organized the first memorial concerts. Through her efforts, many previously unperformed works were issued, and Süssmayr's completion of the Requiem reached the patron. Work born of grief became the start of a revival. But that revival was not quick. In the first decade after his death, Mozart's music was heard rarely. Only Prague kept his memory vivid. Don Giovanni and Figaro remained in favor. People admired his genius and lamented his lack of steady recognition in life. From London, Haydn wrote that Mozart's death was a loss Europe had not yet understood. He was right. Gradually, from the 19th century, the picture changed. The widow passed materials to publishers, collected editions began. Patrons acquired manuscripts. Young musicians, including Ludwig van Beethoven and Carl Czerny, named him their model. In France, his operas entered the stage, and by the 1820s, Austria saw its first complete editions. Comparisons with the giants of the past began in earnest. Mid-century brought a second romantic wave, biographies, treatises, attempts to explain his genius. He was portrayed as a suffering prophet, a radiant martyr, a child of music who died too young. The story of his death, modest burial, and lost grave deepened the tragic aura. Then came the 20th century. Technology, recording, mass performance. Mozart's music filled halls, cinema, radio, records, festivals. His overtures became concert openers. His concertos were staples in conservatories and competitions. His operas returned to the center of major houses' repertoires. Figaro, Don Giovanni, Requiem. They still sound. Today, Mozart's name is known in every country. His portrait is in textbooks. His melodies are studied in music schools. His life is dramatized. His works are dissected in composition classes. Genius became synonymous with him not because of myths, but because of the music itself. Light, transparent, deep, precise. He did not know what his path would be after death. He never lived to hear the triumphs, to know that his Requiem would be sung at emperors' funerals and in cathedrals, films, and concert halls. He left early. Perhaps that is why his music remained timeless, never completed, never exhausted, never reduced to court routine. It still sounds as if unaware that its author has long rested under Viennese earth, in a place no one can name for sure. And perhaps that is what immortality truly is.